We're going to start by making a few changes to the ecosystem in this scene. And one thing I want to do is increase the scale of the maple trees, make them a little bit larger, and also make them more sparse, so that we have a nice distribution of some larger trees mixed in, so that everything is the same size. So with the procedural terrain selected, we're going to go to the xStream menu. I'm going to edit the object material. And the maple tree I've set to 0.08. I'm going to set it to 0.1, which was the original default. And now there's another option, which is the presence option. Right now it's all set to 1. This allows us to control how often these objects are going to be created, or how many there are going to be. If all of them are set to 1, there's basically an equal amount of these objects throughout the scene. Really, a lot of it will depend on the scale of the object, because it's all kind of calculated together. If you've got one really big object, then the presence doesn't have as much of an impact, but these are mostly all around the same size. So I'm going to take the presence of the maple tree and bring it to 0.4. I also don't want to have as many dead trees as there currently are. So let's bring down the large dead tree to actually 0.25. And the plum tree winter, which is basically kind of like a dead tree, we'll go ahead and set that to 0.2. So now we can repopulate. And we're going to see those results. A lot less dead trees, less maples. If we need to, decrease the presence. Or one thing we do is increase the presence of some of the other objects. So you don't just have to go down with it, you can increase the presence amount. So we could change the plum trees to 1.5, the cherry tree to 1.4. I'm going to take the maple and bring it down to 0.2. Maybe the large dead tree to 0.1. Click OK. And now we can see more of a sparse variation of the maple tree, increased cherry trees and plum trees, and a slightly better distribution. Go over to the perspective view. We can view the entire scene. Now I am showing pretty much all the instances and all of the billboards. So I am going to reduce display quality, go to the xStream options, and let's bring that down to 1000. We don't need to have all of those in there. But I want to start by adjusting the lighting. Now, before we had it so the shadows are pretty dark overall. It didn't even look like there was really any ambient light in the scene. So we're going to start by going to the atmosphere editor and modifying the atmosphere. There's a setting under the sky, fog, and haze tab. And it's the scattering of the light. There's glow intensity, and then there's cloud scattering, and then the regular scattering. And it's basically just the anisotropic scattering of light. It works really kind of like a gamma, the overall scattering. The higher the number, the less diffusion of light. At 0, it's pretty much full diffusion, and then it starts to reverse itself and go backwards down to -1. The defaults are around 0.6 or 0.7. Mine right now are turned up a little higher. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to 0.72 and increase my glow. Now these two back and forth have a huge impact on each other. So does the haze amount. And also the aerial perspective. Very important settings. The aerial perspective is the just global thickness of the atmosphere. It is disabled for spherical scenes, but with a regular scene, we can increase that value manually in order to create a nice thickening of the atmosphere. So let's just start with these settings and take a look at a render. Now I am changing my multiplier down to 25%. At 50, it's set to the original view. At 100, it's double what it was before. So that does look like a little bit of inconsistency, and I probably will need to go into the view scene itself and modify that camera. We could also just use a different camera if needed. But whether or not the multipass or G-buffer will render correctly, it's really going to depend. So let's first take a look at how this is going to turn out with just these additional changes. And overall, things are still appearing fairly dark. So we have some other options. We can go to the Atmosphere Editor, and under the Light tab, right now the light balance is set more towards the sunlight, which is going to increase the brightness of the sun and make shadows darker. If we bring it over more towards the ambient side, it's going to tone down the brightness of the scene and the contrast and add more ambient light. We can also set the ambient light amount, whether it's coming from the sky or it's more uniform. From sky typically makes it a little bit of a darker ambient light. The sky dome lighting gain gives you the ability to boost the ambient light on the scene. It will not affect the sky, but it will affect the objects and add the ambient light color and also the overall sky color to the rest of the objects in the scene. A couple of different lighting models, actually quite a few to choose from. The standard lighting model, which is just a basic shading, basic lighting setup, where there's no projected ambient light or variance of ambient light. It's just a direct amount controlled by the light balance. Global ambience is what I have it set to right now. You can also set ambient occlusion, global illumination, and global radiosity, which all have prepasses and also will tie into LIghtwave's radiosity settings. We're going to start with the global ambience. Now, a little more towards ambient light, and take a look at the scene. So, with those changes, the view portion of the scene now has ambient lighting. Shadows are much lighter, and the overall appearance of the scene is balanced more towards the ambient than the intense sun. However, the LIghtwave object and ambient lighting, basically shadows on the back of the castle, are still just as dark. So there's two different options. One is to create a level of ambient light within LIghtwave. And what we can do is go over to Render Globals, Global Illumination. Actually, we do need to go to a different area. I'm going to open the Light tab. So go to the Light object, Light tab. And now we have an ambient intensity for light properties, which is set to 5%. So we can increase this value to, let's say, 20. And also go into and back to the Atmosphere Editor, and under the ambient light color, make a note of the RGB values in order to match the two different colors together. So with that still open, we can go ahead and open the ambient light color and change the RGB values to match. And it's still not quite light enough. So what I'm going to do is go back to the lights and the light panel, increase the ambient intensity to 40%, and may need to decrease the shadow intensity. But one thing I am going to do is go to the sunlight, and we're going to use the xStream edit object. I'm just going to pull up the light editor, and we can reduce the shadow density. Let's go ahead and bring it to 75% and click OK. And we may need to match the LIghtwave shadow settings as well. Which may mean we're going to need to just lighten it up a bit. So that matches quite a bit better. And that's one of our available options to correct the ambient lighting. Now, the much better looking option, although it does take longer to render, is to use radiosity. And we can use the Vue scene to create the radiosity and the lighting for the scene. And since the Vue lighting is a very high dynamic range, very light and dark tones, really good lighting from it, we're going to set that up. So I'm going to turn off the ambient intensity. Go ahead and set those shadows back to black, so 0 all the way across RGB values. And we're going to go to first over to the atmosphere editor. I'm going to go to the sky, fog, and haze, and I'm going to turn up my aerial perspective to 1.5. Take my glow intensity up to 16. Go to the light, increase brightness, and set the light balance to around 50. So bright set to 0.1. Click OK. And now we can go over to render settings, render globals, global illumination tab, turn on radiosity. I'm going to set the type to final gather, and for now I'm going to turn down my rays per evaluation to 32 in order to render this out a little bit faster. And we do need to turn on volumetric radiosity because Vue is a volumetric, and we need that volumetric to be calculated. Otherwise, we're not going to get anything out of the Vue scene. I'm also going to turn on the transparency, and we can go ahead and take a look at a render. So definitely a huge improvement to the quality of the lighting in the scene and the overall contrast. And we can see the alpha. We'll be able to cut out the sky if needed. So at the moment we have radiosity on the LIghtwave objects primarily, but we really don't have the radiosity for the Vue objects. So what we need to do is turn on radiosity for the Vue scene or a global illumination. So what we can do is go to the atmosphere editor. Under the light tab, we can turn on global radiosity. Optimize for outdoor rendering, indirect skylighting. The gain will set kind of an overall amount of intensity. One thing I am going to do for the moment is turn down the quality boost just for the sake of previewing, because we don't get to see the indirect lighting pre-pass. So I am going to go ahead and just reduce that quality while I render. And now the coloration, overall contrast, and light blends are just looking much better. I am going to go back to my render options because I am set to the preview mode and turn that over to the final mode. Final does not include the texture anti-aliasing. That doesn't start until the broadcast mode or if you're using the user mode. I also want to note that you can load in these presets to see exactly what settings they're using. If you go to the user setting and load presets, in the environment folder, which is the same place where you load in the menu branches for the button layout for all the commands. All of the render settings are available, both the Vue 7 and the Vue 8 versions. So you can load in these render settings. You can also save out your own. But if you want to take a look and see what settings they're using for these, because they are grayed out and you don't always have access to advanced effects quality options and things like that. In the standalone with all the additional object anti-aliasing and other settings, you can find out even more about the different settings. So I'm going to make an additional change in the atmosphere editor, going to the sky fog and haze, and increase the aerial perspective a little bit more, and reduce the scattering to 0.6. Go ahead and click OK. And it should look a little bit nicer, add a little more volume to the scene. You can select the camera, move it back a bit. And we can see a little bit more of the terrain, more of the ecosystem. And I'm going to go ahead and render this out. So here is a much larger render. We can see the lighting looks a great deal better than it did before. If we go up to the image controls and turn on the exposure, and even going to the auto mode, you can see some pretty nice lighting. And a really nice contrast. Turning off the auto mode, you can fine-tune it a little bit more. It does cut back on the ambient light, but it does look pretty nice. It's exposed a little more realistically this way with this bright of a sky in this area. But that's because I do have the aerial perspective up rather high, so it is creating a very dense atmosphere. And within the Vue Options panel, under the render options, we have the final gather matching, which allows us to fine-tune the radiosity settings between the two applications, so between the Vue objects, the Vue scene, and the LIghtwave objects and LIghtwave scene. We can also disconnect them from each other, so they won't impact each other. By default, these scales are set to 1, and I went ahead and rendered out a couple of different settings. This setting is with the Vue scale at 1 and the scale host final gather set to 5. So you can see a huge change in the coloration between the last image, some very dark tones, and now seeing how bright the overall impact is. So we're increasing the lighting by scaling the host final gather. The next one, what I did was increase the Vue final gather to a value of 3 with the host final gather at 1. It's not going to make that large of a change in this case because there aren't many LIghtwave objects in the scene. I might be able to take a look at that a little bit closer. And I'm going to go ahead and close out the Vue options panel. So you can see some increased lighting on the trees. It's very subtle. And this last option in the last render is with the Vue or the host final gather set to 2 and the Vue set to 1. So increased lighting on the insides of the object, of what would be the windows, and there are some polygons in there that's not actually cut out in the inside, so those are being lit up. So in this case that would be a little too high, and with my diffusion settings and low sampling of the radiosity, it's a little splotchy. But it is a really nice way to be able to increase the overall intensity individually between the two scenes. And then you can very easily set it up to be able to disconnect either of the calculations to affect the individual objects and the separation between the view and then also the LIghtwave scene. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the Gbuffer and multipass options. So if we go to the render options, we can turn on the Gbuffer and multipass. Now, the biggest limitation of this is that because all the anti-aliasing is handled by LIghtwave, the multipass and Gbuffer will not be anti-aliased. That can cause some problems for stills when you want to be creating some more advanced composites, which is where it's a better solution to render out within the standalone version, because then you can anti-alias all of these different options. The Gbuffer, if you're not familiar, is for compositing applications that support RPF and RLA formats. So you can output that to be able to use the velocity to generate motion blur, setting up the normals, material IDs being different colors between each material, a render ID for objects. Quite a few options if you have a compositing application that supports these formats. Most major compositing applications for video will. Stills, not really going to find too many applications for that, which is where the multipass comes in. And the only major drawback to the multipass as opposed to the Gbuffer is that the velocity channel is not available within the multipass. Most of the other ones can be included within the multipass, with the exception to some of the other options. But for the most part, everything is there. Like I said, the biggest drawback is not having the velocity to be able to calculate motion blur within a different application, although more advanced compositing applications will use the Z-depth to generate a multipass or generate motion blur. Anytime you're rendering out the multipass, it's a really good idea to use the EXR format. Also want to note, when you go to options for the EXR format, always make sure, go to options, turn off the use alpha. Otherwise, the image is going to be pretty much useless. In most of the available pixel type and compression settings work pretty much okay with the defaults. Although the EXR format, if you save it out, let's say you open these up in Photoshop and then save them out from Photoshop, the file sizes do get smaller and they still look exactly the same. The biggest problem with this is that not everything needs the XR format, but it scales really well for limited range images like shadows and things like that, alphas, and material layers that don't, or image layers that don't really have a high level color range. So I definitely suggest EXR for everything. The multi-layer PSD files I've run into problems with corruption, where I can open them once and then the channels become corrupted. So not sure that that's always going to be the best method. So rendering out of LIghtwave, those are not going to be anti-aliased, but you can still save them out. They also will not include any LIghtwave objects in the scene. It's completely separate because that is generated before the LIghtwave objects are. So it's really, in some cases, just better to render out from the standalone version. To give you an idea of what you can get out of the multipass, this is a render I made and broke down scene. This is basically the final version. It's a couple of different camera projections rendered out with multipasses. So take a look at the individual multipass images. This is the XYZ normal that was outputted, where you can see all of the vegetation. And then these are just standard terrains, so they don't have a whole lot of detail to them. Mostly it was just picking up the normal from all of the plants, and then the XY normal. And this is the color output. So this would be the full render. Now, basically, there's one terrain on the left and one on the right, and then a terrain in the front. So if we take a look at the multipass options, under object masks, you can set up to create individual masks for the terrain. In this case, we have really just the procedural terrain, but we also have that small terrain underneath the castle, and then the ground plane. And the global ecosystem is the painted ecosystem, which is not available within the xStream integrated version, but if you go over to the standalone, you'd be able to use the Vue Painter. You can also set up individual masks for materials, and individual material masks for each of the materials within an ecosystem. And then if you have clouds in the scene, you can set up a cloud mask. If you have layers broken down, and now this would be something that would have to be set up within the standalone, setting up your different layers. You can also create masks for those. And then within the extra components and rendering components, you can separate all of the indirect lighting, which is the radiosity backgrounds. We have ambient lighting, shadows, specular diffuse, the atmosphere filters, post-process, Z-depth, and a lot of different options. So if we take a look, we can see this is one of the masks that's available for the ground. And you can see all of the plants that are black in that shot. So now we can just see that ground texture and none of the plant showing by creating a mask for that. So then this is an ecosystem mask. This would be the color output. And then there's also a separate mask for it as well. So you can save just the mask or have the color incorporated with that. And that way you can separate all of these individual elements. So I also did that for the terrains. Even though there's two of them, I pieced them both together and easily cut that out. And then you can set up, this would be the diffusion. This is the shadow output of just the front. Because at this point, I had already rendered out the terrains and projected them separately. And this is the original projection without the ecosystem. So what I did was render out the back portion of the terrains and then projected that onto the object's camera projection, and then applied the ecosystems and rendered that out afterwards, which is why you don't see the shadows within the other layer. You can also see the Z-depth, which has a lot of detail to it. Now this is a bitmap version of the Z-depth, which doesn't have all that much detail to it. It's very choppy, which is why EXR format is greatly preferred. I have another example of Z-depth with EXR. You'd be able to see the overall range much better. So this is just an ecosystem of very tightly grouped trees, not rendered at the highest of quality. And this is the EXR Z-depth. If we take a look at the total range, which is really only a small portion with information in it. So using levels, Control L in Photoshop, I'm going to clip the range. And this is dynamic because it is 32-bit. So I'm going to reduce it down to 16, and then once we hit 16, we can reduce that a little bit more and start to see the detail. So you can see how much depth you can really pull out of the Z-depth. It's got a really amazing calculation for Z-depth for all of these transparent surfaces and all of the object information at really, really long range. So EXR is definitely preferred for that. And with this sort of output, I could just take that layer, toss it on top of the render, and just change the overlay to screen and add fog and kind of haze to it. So you can use these overlays to create some pretty nice post effects. So hard light, we can see that nice haze in the background. So sometimes it's just better to render this stuff out, do it in post. Like I was saying, because xStream Integrated does not have anti-aliased layers, it might be difficult to achieve certain results. But even this doesn't look all that great. That's because the original render wasn't that fantastic. But it gives you a good idea what you can do with the multipass.